This experience was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. My name is Juan, and I am a taxi driver in the city of Hermosillo, Sonora. I mainly work with regular customers who know me and call me when they need a ride. However, occasionally there are people who request my taxi service, and that's where this dark and twisted story begins, which I'm about to share with you. One night I was on my way home after a long day of work. It was almost midnight, and I was near downtown, but everything was closed and dark. Suddenly I saw two people signaling for a ride. I thought about telling them I was off duty, but due to financial needs I decided to stop and take them wherever they were going. I pulled over and saw two men dressed in black. They looked young, but I couldn't describe them well since it was night, and the place wasn't well lit. They asked if I could take them to a place on the outskirts of the city. I agreed, so they got into the taxi and I started driving. I usually try to make conversation with my passengers, to be friendly and make them feel comfortable. But these young men barely responded to my questions. It was clear they didn't want to talk, not even to each other. They were very quiet and the situation started to become uncomfortable. Halfway through, one of them received a call on a very old Nokia phone, one of the first models from around 2001. He answered and said, "We're on our way. Don't start without us." After getting a response, he said, "Yes, we have one with us," and then hung up. I continued driving normally. We were leaving the city, and everything was deserted as we entered the highway. They directed me where to go since they didn't have the exact address. When I asked if we were close, they said it would be another 15 minutes. I was internally upset because they never mentioned it would be so far out of the city. My wife called me, worried about where I was, but before I could answer, the man behind me snatched my phone and threw it out the window. I yelled at him, and that's when he pulled out a knife, pointing it at my neck, and told me to calm down and keep driving. Friends, the fear I felt was indescribable. I thought they wanted to rob me or worse, but nothing could have prepared me for the terrible reality of what these people had planned for me. I told them I would do whatever they asked, just not to hurt me, mentioning my two daughters waiting for me at home. The man simply replied, "Shut up and keep driving and don't say a word." So I obeyed. After some time, they instructed me to turn onto a path through the woods, where nothing could be seen but bushes around us. I was honestly preparing for the worst. We arrived at a dilapidated, dirty 3-story house with no doors or windows. They told me to turn off the car, made me get out, and walk towards the house. I couldn't help but ask what they were going to do to me, mentioning my family didn't have money and we lived day to day on my earnings as a taxi driver. They ordered me to be quiet if I didn't want to get hurt with the knife. They made me enter the house and go up to the second floor. The journey was the most terrifying of my life. It was pitch dark, and I stumbled on the stairs. The place reeked of decay. When we reached the top floor, there was a group of people all dressed in black with cloaks over their heads. They had a small bonfire which allowed me to see everything. I heard screams, saw 3 other people bound hand and foot, with tape over their mouths, desperately crying and shouting. There was a giant pentagram drawn on the floor, and the walls were covered in symbols and phrases in another language. Shortly after arriving, one of the men hit me on the head, and I fell to the floor. I didn't lose consciousness completely, but could still hear their voices. I felt them tying me up like the other victims, and heard someone who seemed to be the leader asking if I was the only one they brought. They apologized for not being able to bring more. I was fading out of consciousness but was slapped back to awareness because they needed me conscious for whatever they planned to do with me and the other kidnapped individuals. They started a ritual, chanting in another language while making small cuts on our bodies and smearing our blood on their faces, drawing strange symbols without stopping their eerie prayers. I was shaking with fear. A girl next to me who was also a victim fainted, and since they needed us conscious for the ritual, they threw her out of the window. When everything went silent outside, they took out knives and approached us. The leader said, "It's time." Desperate screams filled the air, but before they could do anything, someone noticed car lights approaching. They all ran to the window and I heard the sound of a vehicle. Then, gunshots. 3 armed men, soldiers who were in the area searching for a criminal gang, stormed the house. They were our miracle. They untied us and took us to the hospital. I didn't wake up until the next day with my wife by my side, crying with relief at seeing her again. I was told that they managed to capture one of the kidnappers, but the others escaped. The captured man refused to speak, preferring death over breaking his blood pact with the cult. Despite efforts, the other cult members were never found, and the man is still in prison, silent about their whereabouts. They continue to hide, to take innocent people for their satanic rituals, and get away with it, while the number of missing people increases. I am grateful to be here to share my story. It is a miracle that I survived to tell it. Good evening, community. My name is Jose Luis, and this is a paranormal experience that happened to me some years ago when I was working as a taxi driver in Veracruz. It was about 8 p.m., and I had gone out to work in my taxi as I did every night. I usually parked outside the bus terminal since that's where I often found customers. However, that night, before I could reach the terminal, I was stopped at a traffic light when suddenly, out of nowhere, a woman in her 60s dressed entirely in black got into my taxi. I was startled and surprised because she appeared out of thin air. I was a bit annoyed but didn't want to be rude. I simply said good evening and mentioned that next time she should signal before getting in, as it could be dangerous. I hadn't seen her and could have easily run her over. But all she said was, "Take me home, they're waiting for me and I'm in a hurry." She handed me an old piece of paper with an address, so I started driving. I could see in the rearview mirror that the lady was staring at me, not taking her eyes off me. I began to feel uncomfortable because her gaze was so intense and her eyes were red, as if she had just been crying. I asked if she was okay, and she replied that she needed to get home quickly to her husband and son. So I sped up to get there faster. But when I arrived at the address she had given me, it was a desolate area with only one house, which was completely abandoned. I told her I must have gotten lost and asked for directions, but then she said, "This is it, thank you." She got out of my taxi and went into the abandoned house. I was very confused. I couldn't just leave her there since the place looked dangerous. I waited in my taxi, hoping she would come out, but she didn't. So I decided to get out and call out to her to see if she was okay, but there was no response. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave her there. I peeked into the one-story house, using my cell phone light, but couldn't find the lady. She had disappeared. I ran back to my taxi and drove off, feeling very confused and a bit scared. When I got home, I searched the address online because I couldn't shake off my curiosity. The search results led me to links about a tragedy that had occurred there. 10 years ago, that house was completely destroyed in a fire caused by a gas leak, killing a man and his 8-year-old son inside. As I dug deeper, I found a picture of the woman who had gotten into my taxi. The note said she was the mother and wife of the victims of that fire. She had been out of town for work that night, but when she received the news, She had a heart attack and died before she could return home. I was chilled to the bone reading the news. Everything started to make sense in my head. That poor woman was still trying to get home to her family. I couldn't believe that such a thing had happened to me. I never imagined I would have an encounter with a ghost, but it happened. And to this day, I still don't understand why me of all people.